When I was at school in the sixth form, we had a physics master who used to call us gentlemen. That was more in hope than anger. And he used to say, "Gentlemen, I have taught you all I know, and you still know nothing." I stand before you as living evidence that he was correct in what he said. Now, the synopsis in the programme for this talk says last year's Blavatsky lecture talked of the energy field of the chakras and weaving therein patterns appropriate to the need of the moment. In this talk, I'm going to do what my second wife, Rosemary, always advised us to do: consider the implications. So I'm going to consider the implications of this suggestion, and in particular, who perceives the need and who weaves the pattern. Now, I have to begin by giving you the background. Where am I coming from? And hopefully, the first thing I have to remind you of is that we are here to enjoy ourselves. Because the word enjoy does not mean take joy from, it means bring joy through. And in the heart of your being, in the heart of my being, is a source of joy, which is always longing to leap into the action, always longing to be expressed, and often stifled because it is not appropriate to the perceived need of the moment. The second important thing is this chap Heisenberg, who was a particle physicist. And he made a very profound statement. What we study is not nature herself, but nature exposed to our mode of questioning. Consider the implications of that. And for nature, read Theosophy. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is not Theosophy itself. It's Theosophy exposed to my mode of questioning. And my mode of questioning is driven by the urge to reach a dynamic and purposeful concept of myself and of my role as a member of the human race. So that is the driving urge behind all that I'm going to talk about this morning. It's quite awkward having the push buttons behind me, but I hope we'll work. Yes. The urge to reach a concept which is inspiring, motivating, practical, and enabling for me. So right at the start, please understand what I'm going to talk about, the things I suggest that I'm trying to do and why I'm trying to do them, the processes I'm trying to apply. They suit me at my present stage in the unfoldment of that part of the collective human archetype entrusted to me for expression and assimilation. Gardner, my good friend Edward Gardner, suggested that the future for any individual rests in that part of the collective human archetype, he says, allotted to them. And I used to say that, and then somebody said to me, "Who allotted it?" And because I couldn't answer that question, I changed it and said, entrusted to us. Nobody's asked me who entrusted it, but it is ours in trust. It is that part of the collective human archetype, and if we do not express our part of that archetype, the expression of it through this evolutionary plan will be in some measure incomplete. So it is a trust, and we are trusted to try to do that. Oh, I'm sorry, we've got a bit behind on the slide. Yes. Now, in order to... Well, after I had come across that statement of Gardner's, about 25 years later, I came across Assagioli. Gary mentioned Assagioli yesterday, and that is Assagioli's model of man and the universe. As you can see from the labels, there are various parts to it. The collective unconscious, then there's a membrane which doesn't divide, it permits continuous exchange between what is inside that oval and what is outside. And then inside there are three levels: the higher unconscious, the middle unconscious, the lower unconscious. Then there's the circle of the field of consciousness. Then there's the little I, and at the top there is an asterisk. It was an asterisk on his diagram. And that asterisk, in later editions of his book, he refers to that asterisk as the transpersonal self. I don't think he gave it a name in the book that I originally came across it in. In fact, I didn't come across it in a book. It was presented at a Theosophy Science weekend by my very good friend and my present wife's first husband, Arthur Ellison. And he presented Assagioli's model, and what he did basically was to put that diagram on the board and then talk about it. And that's a very good way of doing it. Now, I've skimmed through that because I'm not interested this morning in the detail of that. Gary gave a brief exposition of what that detail entails in his talk yesterday. What interests me is that my concept of myself, I refer to the symbol at the top of the diagram as the star of being. The oval shape is the envelope of self. The envelope of self has certain characteristics. It's my term, it's not Assagioli's. It is an envelope of matter partially segregated from the collective unconscious and temporarily personalized under my personal influence or control. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is very largely... I want to go back, and that takes about 3 clicks, I think. What? No, that's too far. What I'm going to talk about is this envelope of self, the star of being, and in particular, what goes on in that envelope, and how can the energy of the star have a direct impact, a direct influence, and eventually a direct control over what goes on inside that envelope. Now, I want to go forward again to where we were. Yes, using this concept of myself, I have developed a visualization which we will come to in due course. Because I mentioned them later, I want to give a brief explanation now of 2 things which are of significance in the course of this talk. The first one comes from my training as an electrical engineer. And one of the things that I discovered in the course of my training was that when we generate electricity, the voltage, which is the driving force, appears first, and the current, which is the flow of energy, follows a little later. It lags behind. So we have voltage and current. Voltage appearing first, current lagging a bit behind. And we, as human beings, are very much electrical things. The physical nervous system, for instance, uses electrical signals in its communication with the rest of the body. So I took it that this idea of... Now, I'm going too fast. The other word in electrical terms for voltage is potential. And so optimum use of electricity arises when the current that flows is aligned to the potential behind it. And that is true for us. Optimum operation for us is when our current activity is aligned to our true source. Our true source I've already mentioned. Gardner's suggestion that there is a part of the collective human archetype entrusted to us for expression. So when our current activity is in line with our true source, which of course is also the star of being, then we are in optimum operating condition. In electrical terms, that condition of current aligned with potential is called significantly unity power factor. And so we too operate most effectively and most efficiently when we operate at unity power factor, when we are at one with and in ourselves. That is the true meaning of at one meant. Nothing about atoning, it's just getting yourself aligned. Now, later on I shall mention it again, but I want to say right now, we are able to choose whether our current activity will be aligned to our true potential, our true source. We are able to choose always, in every situation, under every circumstances. We are able to choose, but only if we keep awake. Soon as we go to sleep, we react instead of responding. And there is a significant and inestimable difference between the two. So that is power factor and the idea of aligning our current activity with our true potential. The other thing that I want to mention is a term I use, and I'm not sure how common it is, a term that I use, note of being. Now, I'm aware of the suggestion, not to say stated fact, that the creative word behind the manifestation of the universe is the word Om. And to me, the word Om, as it sounds through me, as it sounds, if you like, through that part of the collective human archetype which is mine to express, the sound of Om through that as a filter is the note of my being. And so later on I suggest that when we align ourselves, when we are at peace, we are at resonance with our note of being. And I shall suggest what the effect of that resonance is. Now, the whole purpose of what I'm going to talk about is really saying, there is the envelope of self. That is that part of the collective unconscious, the collective whatever, which is mine to seek, to use and to influence and eventually to control. And when I succeed in doing that and expanding it in the process, when I have no further need of it, then that will break up and I shall be free to venture into the universe at large. I think. Right. Now I want to... I'll turn my back just for a moment. Please excuse the... Yes. The reason I'm interested in what goes on in the envelope of self is partly because it is an expression of my inner source and my inner resource, and partly because the quality of my doing depends upon the state of my being, And the state of my being is what is the basic state of that envelope of self. Is it always turned up and excited, or is it calm and clear and able to reflect what is going on in the world outside for the observation of the inner ruler, the star of being? There are numerous terms for this inner part of us: the inner self, the higher self, the star of being. A Quaker named John Woolmer referred to it as the principle planted in the human mind. So there's all sorts of ways of referring it. I have all my life been a wordsmith. I play around with words. I extract from words meanings that nobody else seems to have found. And I'm coming now to the view that the meaning of words is useful and sometimes important, but much more significant is what the word can do. I discovered this in my favourite book, the Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse. And I discovered it because there are poems in there where the words are of significance, the metre and the rhyme and so on all impinge upon the total effect of the poem. But there are poems in there where the words have no significance other than the atmosphere that they generate when you read them slowly and carefully and let them sound in you. I discovered that when I was on a Theosophical lecture tour, and I arrived in Sidmouth about 12 o'clock and had some lunch, and I was due to give a talk in the afternoon. And I was very tired, and I sat down, and instead of going to sleep, I opened my book of English Mystical Verse. And there was a poem there which was exactly what I've just been talking about. The words in it created an effect, and that effect was woof. It wasn't actually woof, it was woof. It gradually lifted me out of my tired physical body into a peaceful, energetic area of my being and restored my energies. So that's how I discovered that words have all sorts of different uses. I sometimes think that the real use of words is not to communicate. The use of words is to capture the attention of the person to whom you are talking, so that something of the thought behind those words may be directly communicated because they're giving you their attention. Now, if you think about it, the personal self has only one thing to give: its attention. And we are able to choose where will we give our attention, and will we withdraw our attention before we've actually got the message. Right, let me see if I can get back to where I should be. Oh, I just talked about that. Yes, we said all that. We're going to finish before we started if we're not careful. Yes. Last year in the Blavatsky lecture, I started this visualization from the point of view of an idea of Barbara Brennan's. She is a spiritual healer. She was a physicist originally, and she has done a lot of healing work and a lot of work with the chakras. And this is how books work for me. When my second wife, Rosemary, was ill with cancer, I had a friend who suggested to me that the National Health Service would look after the plumbing, the blood system, and the electrics, the nervous system, and I should seek to do something about what was behind them. And he suggested I should get this book. And I delayed and procrastinated and didn't have the opportunity, and eventually I got it. And I took it home, and Rosemary, being Rosemary, opened up the book at the beginning and looked at the credits and then the title page and then the index and so on, and eventually started to read it. When she put it down, I picked it up and it opened. And it opened at the page which contained the information I needed. Brennan said, "I have never observed a case of cancer without the associated chakra is disfigured." So that told me where might be the underlying energy pattern behind Rosemary's problems and what I could do about it. And that was the starting point, trying to restore the chakras to their best optimum form. But I found a different starting point now. I came across this book, Wheels of Life, by somebody who sounds as if he's got the name round the wrong way. But that is her name. Anadia, and Judith is her surname. And her book is called Wheels of Life. And she talks about the current of manifestation and the current of liberation. That's her diagram. There's the 7 major chakras with their various symbols, all of which are fascinating and well worth studying. Then she talks of the manifesting current proceeding down and the liberating current proceeding upwards. Now she says the downward current, which she calls the current of manifestation, begins in pure consciousness and descends through the chakras into the manifested plane, gradually becoming denser and denser at each step. She gives a very good example. To produce a theatrical play, we must begin with an idea or concept, which is chakra 7, which can be communicated to others in the form of a story. This becomes a set of images, chakra 6, which can be communicated to others in the form of a story, chakra 5. As the idea further develops and others get involved, we enter a set of relationships which bring it about, chakra 4. We give it our will and energy, chakra 3, rehearsing the movements and bringing its conceptual and physical plane activity in front of an audience. And then we manifest the play on the physical plane, and that's chakra 1. So we've taken the abstract conception down through the chakras in succession and brought it into manifestation. So she calls that process the manifesting current. And that is the particular idea that I want to use this morning in the revised visualization that I'm going to introduce you. One of the unexpected influences on my theosophical exploration and unfoldment has been a book called Seeds of Contemplation, written by Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk. I bought the book when I was a member of Rugby Lodge in about 1957. And then I lent it to various people, and fortunately, one of them forgot to return it. So I had to get hold of a second copy. And in the second copy, Thomas Merton had added, right at the start, a chapter entitled, "What is Contemplation?" He, considering he was a Catholic, or perhaps, as he would say, because he was a Catholic, he has some very insightful observations to make. His prose and what he describes in support of his contemplation is very similar to the prose of Krishnamurti. This colt in this field on this April day is unique. Never happened before, will never happen again. It's a unique moment. Anyway, getting back to the point. from his chapter on what is contemplation, one of the suggestions he makes is, contemplation is the vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us proceed from an invisible, transcendent, infinitely abundant source. And elsewhere in the book, but I bring the two together out of mischief because it suits me, this is what I want you to believe for this morning. We are able to choose whether we ourselves and that part of his world which is ours shall be aware of that source, consecrated by it, transfigured in its light. Now, I found that inspiring. I have now changed it. I've changed it because I want to say we are able to choose whether our action at this moment in time shall be aligned with our true source, attuned to it, releasing its energy to initiate that action and to flow into and through that action. We are able to choose. That is the extent of our free will. I used to give a talk called Precognition of Free Will, and after I'd been giving it on and off for about 10 years, I eventually came round to the idea, well, what is free will? And is free will incompatible with the possibility of precognition? And I was able to demonstrate that there was a very good likelihood that precognition genuinely took place. And I was also able to demonstrate that that did not contradict our notion of free will. Even if every event in our life is predestined, preordained, we are free to choose on every occasion, in every circumstance. We are free to choose what will be our response. And it is that response which impacts directly, usefully or otherwise, on our envelope of self. It's that response which determines the sensitivity of the matter that we have under our current influence and control. It's that response which decides in the end our character and our personality. We are always able to choose our response, although most of the time, speaking for myself, I have reacted before I have chosen. But that's a problem that I'm attempting to deal with. Hopefully I'll make some progress in this incarnation. So, the other very important thing about the action at this moment in time is the point I've already made, but I'll make it again. When our action at this moment in time is aligned with our true source, we are at peace, at one with ourselves. And the infinite peace of that alignment with the star of being, that infinite peace embracing this personal self, brings it to resonance with the note of being. And I take Om on the in-breath to lift my consciousness as deep, as high, as inward as I possibly can, releasing the energy of the star to flow as the manifesting current. And that energy flows down through the 7 major chakras, awakening and enlivening, making them vibrant, scintillating. And that flow of energy from the star down through the chakras induces them to work together in beautiful, balanced, rhythmic integration to generate in the envelope of self an energy field aligned with, attuned to, at the service of the star of being. Into the energy field of the chakras shines the ray of the star to illumine and to bless, setting that energy field shimmering and dancing in the song of the solar system, weaving energy patterns appropriate to the need of the moment, awakening the subtle vibrations necessary to enable the divine purpose of the universe to unfold, to enable for each one of us that part of the collective human archetype entrusted to us to unfold, bringing coherence to the field, the wisdom, the insight, the perspective needed for appropriate action. So, that is my current method of seeking to render the envelope of self more useful to the indwelling star of being. Seeking to tune it, seeking to awaken in it the frequencies which can respond to the promptings which come from the inner levels of my being. I know there are promptings from that level because I've experienced them. But I can't command them and I can't control them. I'm seeking to discover how best to make it possible for them to provide the influence and the energy input which is so vitalizing, so inspiring. So it's time to have a look at what I said we were going to look at, and that is weaving energy patterns. Now, I have a number of examples. I'm leaving them aside at the moment. I have a habit of preparing a talk and then following a few side tracks, which are very interesting and perhaps very amusing, and then I suddenly find time is up and I haven't made the point I wanted to make in the talk. So I'm going to avoid that error today, and I'm going to give you the 3 examples that matter now, and then if time permits and interest prevails, I can tell you the other things which are fascinating and amusing and informing, but they're not what I want today. What I want today is to give you 3 examples from, well, no, 2 examples from the reported life of Jesus, and 1 example which I originally invented because I thought it was what might have happened. So the first example is the way that Jesus tried to get over the points he wanted to get to the general populace. The metaphysical point, if you like, that he wanted to make was way up there. And so he translated them into parables, stories where they could identify with the process of the story. They could identify with what was happening. They could see the various characters, and they could form their own conclusion about who was the good friend, who was the good Samaritan, and so on. So that was one way in which he weaved energy patterns appropriate to the need of the moment. But who perceived the need? Was it Jesus, or was it the Christ principle within? And who weaved the energy pattern. It needed Jesus' personality to weave that pattern in terms that could be understood. But who actually prompted that weaving? Did it come from the personality or from the inner self? And then I remember very vividly the film of the life of Jesus in which Robert Powell played the role of Jesus. And Robert Powell had very piercing blue eyes. And I can see now the scene in that film where the woman was taken in adultery and the villagers were about to stone her as their law prescribed. And one of the villagers noticed Jesus, Robert Powell, sitting in the dusty side and drawing in the dust with a stick. And so he said to his friends, just a moment, and he went across to Jesus and he said, "Master, this woman has been taken in adultery, which is a sin, and our law requires that she should be stoned. What do you say?" And Robert Powell finished his drawing in the sand and he looked up and said, "Let he who is without sin amongst you cast the first stone." He didn't say, "Your law requires it, but you should show compassion." He didn't say you should ignore your law. He just helped them to see the situation in a different perspective. Let he who is without sin among... Now they were all amongst their friends. They were all in front of him, and they knew that his insight would tell him whether they were or were not without sin. So one by one, they sheepishly put down their stone and walked away. So there was another energy pattern appropriate to the need of the moment. Now, I got interested in the search for truth. And I imagined that one of Jesus' disciples would come to him and say, "Master, what must I do to become more like you?" And I imagined that Jesus, with his infinite wisdom and his infinite compassion and his different perspective, would look at that disciple and he could see what was his temperament, what were his characteristics, what was his path of unfoldment in this incarnation, and he would give him a piece of advice which would help him to take the next step in his unfoldment. And then I could imagine another disciple coming to Jesus and asking the same question, "Master, what must I do to become more like you?" And Jesus would look at him, and with his infinite wisdom, compassion, perspective, he would see where that disciple was on his path of unfoldment. And he would give him a piece of advice to help him take his next step. Totally different from the advice given to the first one. And so there would be possibly 11, possibly 12 different pieces of advice. And then when Jesus disappeared from the scene, somebody would come along and say, "You knew him. What must I do to become more like him?" And the disciple had only one answer. "When I asked him that question, this is what he told me." And he'd repeat the advice, which in 11 cases out of 12 would be totally inappropriate for the person who asked. But unfortunately, for 1 in 12, it would be right. And so when people came back and said, "It doesn't work for me," the answer was always, "Persevere." Now, I'm now coming round to the idea that perhaps that is not what might have happened. When the disciple came to Jesus and said, "Master, what must I do to be more like you?" I wonder whether Jesus just aligned. And in aligning himself from inmost source of being to outermost active part, he would induce that same alignment in the disciple. Not alignment with him, alignment of the disciple with that part of the collective human archetype allotted to him. So that suggests to me that if I can align myself with my centre, the greatest service I can do for anybody else is invite them to come and sit beside me. Oh, I think it's still there. So I've changed my view about what might have happened there, but you pay your money and you take your choice. And perhaps it was a bit of each. So I'll skip over. I want to end up in the same place that we started before this talk began, and that is with some thoughts on serving humanity. It's a short passage which comes from a book of that title, and I'm just going to read it again and add one sentence at the end, and that's where we will draw the talk to a conclusion just about spot on time. So on the back cover of the book, true service is the spontaneous outflow of a loving heart and an intelligent mind. It is the result of being in the right place and staying there. It is produced by the inevitable inflow of spiritual force, and not by strenuous physical plane activity. It is the effect of a man's being what he truly is, a divine Son of God, and not by the studied effect of his words or deeds. And then he goes on with some very interesting comments. What is service? Service can be described briefly as the spontaneous effect of soul contact between one soul and another. And then it makes the most interesting point of all, perhaps. If the urge to satisfy desire is the basic urge of the form life of man, the urge to serve humanity is an equally basic urge of the soul of man. So if we want to do as I suggested at the start and enjoy ourselves, we have to bring joy to the whole of humanity.